The launch roster was full. Every pilot briefed, every loadout confirmed. No one said Morgan couldn't fly. But when she stepped onto the line, they treated her like background noise, last to taxi, last to lift, and always just a little too careful. They laughed when she held back, said she overthought everything. And then everything changed. Above a narrow mountain pass, with fire on the ridgeline and no one left overhead, one aircraft stayed, long after others cycled out, long after fuel gauges said it was time to go. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story intrigues you, please consider subscribing to hear more untold stories of extraordinary service and the heroes who walk among us, never asking for the recognition they deserve. The air at the forward base carried the taste of rusted steel and fine sand, stirred constantly by rotor wash and sun-baked thermals coming off the tarmac. It was the kind of place where time didn't pass. It baked. Heat shimmered off the concrete, turning distant outlines into mirages. The ridgeline stood still in the distance, dark teeth on the horizon. Within that silence, the motion of men and machines ground on steady, rough routine. Morgan stood beside her A-10 on the outer edge of the staging strip, alone with her checklist. The paper was already creased from folding, its corners blackened with oil smudges and graphite wear. She held it flat with one gloved hand and tapped a finger down the sequence, cross-checking the hydraulic systems again. Her gloves, regulation gray with black stretch in the knuckles, hung clipped to her belt when not in use. She didn't toss them on the dash like the others. She didn't toss anything. Behind her, maintenance crews rolled by with tool carts and fuel lines. A wheeled rig coughed, backfired, then settled. A crew chief gave her a thumbs up as he disconnected the line. She nodded once and kept her eyes on the panel. No rush, no wasted motion. The tent where the other pilots gathered was loud with easy confidence. Laughter spilled out with the flaps swinging wide every few minutes. Someone shouted for another energy drink. The mission briefing had been straightforward, a 6-ship KAS rotation, holding overwatch along a known convoy corridor near a pass called Narrow 7. There had been chatter about dust threats and wind shear, but the kind of problems that didn't raise heart rates. Most treated it like another muscle memory run. Morgan entered the tent just long enough to sign for her mission board. The laminated surface still bore the ghost of dry marker from the previous shift. Her own call sign, half erased, clung faintly at the bottom of the roster in faded red. Someone had written "last in" beside it a few days ago, meant as a joke. No one had bothered to wipe it clean. She didn't say anything as she scanned the updates. Weather front stable. Surface winds cross from the south. Visibility listed as 10 miles with minor distortion at elevation. The others glanced up but didn't greet her. Not cold, just fast-moving. A pilot named Brendan, boots up on a cooler, leaned sideways and smirked. Try not to overthink your crosshairs today. Morgan, whole war might end before you fire. She looked at him for a half second, then returned her board to the clip without response. The mission was scheduled to launch staggered. She was in the final slot, a practical position, but one that got noticed when the first group had already spooled engines and you were still running checklists. Morgan walked back across the heat-slick ramp as 2 A-10s ahead of her taxied clear. Their turbines gave off that unmistakable dry roar, like a sandblaster in slow motion. One of the crew chiefs gave her a small wave as she passed. She acknowledged him with a nod but said nothing. She was already half inside her own cockpit before her flight boots left the ground. Inside, she moved with practiced sequence. Not fast, not dragging. She ran through startup like a ritual, eyes never darting, only shifting. Her left hand adjusted oxygen flow. Right hand rested briefly on the armrest before initiating system link-up. The front panel flickered once, then stabilized. One gauge showed low, then bounced. She tapped it once with a knuckle and watched it again. Stable. She noted it anyway. Small irregularities mattered. Up front, another pilot called tower and asked for early clearance. Laughter came through the open radio circuit. Someone cracked a joke about saving a burger back at the mess. Morgan said nothing. She was still inside the final 6 lines of her system check when that pilot lifted off ahead of schedule. The moment her own turbines reached stable thrust, she rolled forward slowly, easing the aircraft toward runway position. No ceremony, no radio wit, just tires over pavement and sunlight flashing across the curved surfaces of the Hog's thick wings. From above, the pattern looked unremarkable. Another bird late to launch, another slot behind schedule. But down at ground level, near the tent, one of the mechanics watched her go with a thoughtful expression. He glanced back once at the whiteboard, the faint trace of "last in" still clinging to the corner. Then he turned and went back to work. Morgan climbed to taxi position and held, waiting for clearance like always. Not because she had to, because it mattered. She reached to fold her checklist again, sharp and neat, and tucked it into her left sleeve pocket like she always did. The war didn't need volume. It needed watchers, and watchers didn't waste time proving they were fast. They just made sure everything worked when it had to. She never looked rushed, and no one ever saw her miss. The mountains stretched out below them like frozen waves, harsh and gray and sun-scoured. Narrow 7 ran down the middle of the range like a scar, steep on both sides, with long switchbacks carved by decades of erosion and traffic. The flight of A-10s held a wide line above it, scattered just enough to call it a formation if no one looked too closely. Comms were already active, full of the kind of chatter that came with overconfidence. One voice marked a ridge and called out, "Possible insurgent volleyball match. Top of the rise." Another came through right after, laughing, "Copy that. We'll send the play-by-play." The mood in the air was light, detached, routine. Morgan flew in trail, just under 1,000 feet higher than the rest. She hadn't spoken once since takeoff. Her HUD flickered clean lines across the valley, but her focus wasn't on them. Her hands stayed low on the stick and throttle, pressure measured by habit. The silence in her cockpit felt different than theirs. Not empty. Intentional. Below, the terrain rolled in uneven patches of dry rock and broken brush. The wind curled off the peaks with just enough force to tug at trim, but nothing unusual. She compensated automatically, eyes already marking heat shapes across the ridgeline. Her kneeboard held a clear overlay of expected thermal anomalies. Most matched. One did not. She checked it twice. A small rise to the east gave off a slow bloom heat signature, wider than it should have been and too regular in shape. No vehicle appeared nearby. She pinged it once on the net. No response. The other aircraft continued forward. Brendan's voice cut through the static. "Gonna drop down and say hello to the rocks. Call me if you see my teeth." His A-10 banked sharply and dipped below the ridge, executing a tight roll and leveling low across the canyon mouth. His wingtip nearly clipped the shadow edge before pulling back into pattern. Laughter followed. Someone added, "Save some gas for the ride home." Seconds later, a different pilot cut in with a flat tone, calling bingo, pulling back toward refuel vector. No urgency, just protocol. Morgan glanced once at her fuel readout. It blinked, low, then mid-range, then low again. She tapped the panel. The numbers stabilized at 60%. She noted it mentally. She had seen that glitch before, old wiring lag under heat stress. Not dangerous, but unreliable. She returned to the irregular heat bloom. Still active. Still quiet. The others didn't seem to notice, or care. She adjusted her flight vector by a few degrees and let the aircraft drift slightly west of the main corridor. Just enough to keep visual line on the source without announcing it. She tapped her marker system and logged it silently. Down below, the convoy she was supposed to watch hadn't arrived yet. Dust trails moved in the far west, behind the pass. Timing suggested they'd be under the ridge in 10 minutes. The air remained clear. No weapons fire, no smoke, but her instincts kept circling the bloom. Another voice came through. "Nice day up here. Feels like one of those zero-contact flights. We should get points for peaceful air." Morgan responded once, her voice even and unhurried. "Grid confirm. Sector 348. Altitude level 10.5. That was it. She didn't comment on the heat bloom, didn't guess. She just watched. The flight began to drift wider apart as fuel levels dropped and terrain markers rolled by. The valley widened near the far end, giving false comfort. Radios shifted to less disciplined tones. Someone called in a terrain feature they'd nicknamed the icebox, and another pilot added that it looked more like a urinal. The laughter came again. Morgan stayed 5 miles behind the farthest ship, still aligned with the convoy's projected path. The sun had started its tilt, casting new angles across the ridges. She adjusted her filters and cycled her contrast sweep. The thermal anomaly flickered again, not in strength, but in pattern. It didn't bloom. It blinked, as if something had just powered up beneath the rock face. She made no call, just tapped the side of her kneeboard and wrote it in by hand, one clean stroke across the margin. She stared at the ridge for a moment longer. Then she made a minor altitude adjustment and rolled slightly right, keeping herself in a wide loop above the anomaly. The others moved on. One was already talking about chow rotation. Another requested a turn on a different angle for photography. They were already mentally back at the base. Morgan remained over the middle, her voice silent, her data stream active. She saw the bloom blink again, and she stayed. The pass narrowed to a single corridor, winding between stone outcrops and shale cliffs. The convoy below moved in tight formation, slow and deliberate, as dust plumes rose in low spirals behind the armored trucks. Nothing looked wrong. The ridgelines held still. The brush didn't move. The sun pressed flat shadows into the rocks, softening depth perception. Then, without warning, the entire valley held its breath. It started with a flicker light reflecting wrong from a high slope, then another. On the left ridge, dust lifted in twin jets. No sound at first. Then came the concussive crack of 2 RPG launches. Their trails looped fast toward the road like slashes of chalk. One detonated against the lead vehicle. The other struck a rock shelf behind the last truck, showering the path with debris. Machine gun fire opened up from 3 positions almost at once, staggered across elevation like a trap sprung on a clock. The convoy broke formation. A fire team dismounted and took cover behind their lead truck, trying to suppress fire with limited angles. Their calls came over the net in fast layers, overlapping and rising in urgency. We're hit at Point Alpha. Contact East Ridge. East Ridge. We've got movement on the spine above us, can't get elevation. One of the overhead Apaches surged forward, calling visual on enemy muzzle flashes, but within seconds reported critical fuel levels and turned toward a southern fallback route. Another A-10 gave a clipped transmission declaring bingo and broke off toward base. Morgan didn't follow. She held altitude and turned her aircraft into a wide loop above the valley, coming up slowly behind the ridgeline where she had seen the earlier thermal irregularity. The heat bloom had not been false. She brought her aircraft into a holding arc, wings steady, no drop in altitude. Below her, tracers lit the air. Fire from the ridge hit near the middle of the convoy, bouncing sparks off armored plates. One of the troops shouted into the radio that they had wounded and were pinned without air cover. Morgan said nothing. She adjusted her reticle slowly, sweeping her HUD across the eastern slope. Her finger rested beside the trigger guard. Never tensed. Her eyes moved faster than her hands. Each flicker of movement down below was tracked and noted. But she didn't fire. She waited for confirmation, a pattern, a repeat muzzle flash, a shape that stayed still too long in the wrong place. Her system chirped with a partial lock. She canceled it. Above her left console, the fuel gauge blinked twice. The reading dropped to near empty. She tapped the edge of the screen once. It flickered to 30%, then blanked again. She didn't react. A voice from command came across her secure line. Calm, procedural. Be advised, your last fuel report showed unreliable readout. Recommend return to base. Confirm status. She kept her aircraft on station. The ridge lit again with automatic fire, and another truck took damage on the left flank. A plume of smoke rolled down the incline and covered the lower trail in haze. She tracked the shot to origin, not just a heat spot. Now, she saw the shape behind it. Human. Crouched. Moving backward behind a stone brace. Her gloved hand moved to the master arm switch. She flipped it once and let her eyes settle behind the visor edge. The reticle slowed, hovered, then locked. A breath passed. She squeezed. Her first burst struck clean, flattening the outcrop where the shooter had hidden. The firing stopped for 4 full seconds. It wasn't long, but it was enough. The ground team called out that they were repositioning. She adjusted her arc and climbed 100 feet, then rolled again, scanning the opposite ridge. No words came from her cockpit, only the slow, mechanical hum of systems aligning and the barely audible hiss of her oxygen flow under the helmet. Another shot rang out from the far right. She saw it before she heard it. A long muzzle flash from a ridgeline shelf. She marked it manually and circled back, aligning her angle of attack low and level with the cliff edge. Her HUD blinked. No telemetry. She didn't need it. She fired again. This time, the sound echoed longer in the valley. Command repeated the call. Last in respond status. She didn't answer. The radio hissed back to silence. Below, the convoy began to move again. Not far, but enough. The presence overhead wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It didn't ask permission. It stayed. The sky over Narrow 7 held a kind of stillness that came only after everything else had gone. No more friendly air traffic. No more banter on the net. No sound but the deep, sustained hum of Morgan's engines as her A-10 circled in slow, deliberate arcs above the pinned convoy. The valley had shifted from urgency to endurance, from shouting to silence. Smoke trailed weakly from a disabled vehicle. Its rear axle split, on the high ridgeline. Nothing moved at first. Then, faint and jagged, came another burst of fire, short, inaccurate, probing. The enemy had expected the air cover to cycle out. Most of it had, but not all of it. Morgan adjusted her vector by 2 degrees and began her first return pass. The hog dipped gently, hugging the inside wall of the valley where the wind curved tight and sharp. Her left hand rested on the throttle, steady. The right moved with care over the stick, making no wasted input. Her targeting screen blinked and fuzzed. The dust on its surface caught the sun in one ragged smear. She didn't bother wiping it. She no longer used the targeting computer. It had struggled since the first loop through smoke. Instead, she relied on a grease pencil mark she had placed on her side window days ago during a calibration drill. It lined up near the 4 o'clock frame when her angle and trim were just right. It was there now. She matched it without thinking. Down below, the troops had taken shelter in a small cut just below a shale crest. Their voices came low, not to her but to each other, half audible across the open circuit. A medic requested cover to reach a wounded gunner. Another voice broke in, quieter than the rest. That's the same hog, isn't it? She's still circling. A second answered, more certain this time. Yeah, that's her. Morgan banked gently and let the sun slide across her canopy. Her HUD flickered red in one corner, briefly showing 0 fuel. She tapped the console twice. It returned to 1/3, then blinked again. She ignored it. She had memorized her throttle curve. What she had left didn't change how long she would stay. She leveled out at altitude and ran her next pass lower. The enemy had reappeared along the ridge, moving in 2s and 3s. They tried to shift positions under cover, but the smoke betrayed them. Morgan rolled left, dropped airspeed, and released a controlled burst that struck the slope ahead of their path. It was not meant to kill. It was meant to stop movement. And it did. The echo of her GAU-8 filled the valley in a low, rattling growl. For a few seconds afterward, there was no fire at all. From her canopy, Morgan scanned the ridgelines without narration. Her hands stayed light on the controls, adjusting trim by instinct. A gust from the east bank pulled at her frame, but she rolled with it, nose down, keeping sightlines clear. On her third pass, she dipped low enough to see a single figure attempting to reposition with a tube launcher half exposed. She didn't lock. She didn't need to. She fired short. The man disappeared in a cloud of rock and dirt. The radio flared. A voice from the ground said, "That one was close. You knocked that shelf clean off." Morgan finally answered. Her voice came through dry and even. "Still here?" She pulled up, slow and deliberate, giving the troops a window to relocate. A sergeant barked orders in the background. There was movement now, disciplined, organized. The convoy tightened its perimeter. No one cheered, but there was no more panic in the air. She turned for another pass, slightly offset from the last. This one would be lateral, covering a blind spot in the rock wall that could still house remaining shooters. Her HUD display struggled with contrast again. She leaned slightly left and relied on the sunlight to trace angles along the ridge. One corner of the cliff showed a gap too regular in shape. She fired once, not in anger, but with precision. The gap collapsed. The enemy stopped firing. The next pass was clean. No movement, no muzzle flashes, no new threats. She circled anyway. Each orbit took more from the hog. The systems lagged. Gauges gave her nothing stable. Her airframe protested in small tremors beneath her boots, but she kept going. 10 minutes, then 15. Each time she considered pulling away, the silence below asked her not to. The final pass came just past the 20-minute mark. She saw only stillness now. The ridges were quiet. The smoke had drifted west and thinned. The wind pushed it low along the pass, clearing the view. She passed directly overhead one last time. A voice on the ground said, "She's still up there. You see that's her again?" Another voice responded, "She never left." Morgan climbed gently, easing back on throttle. She gained altitude slowly, not out of retreat, but respect. Below, the troops gathered around their vehicles, not in formation, not in triumph, just quiet, looking upward. In her HUD, the faint reflection of her own face remained, calm, sharp-eyed, lit only by fading backlight. Her instruments gave her nothing new. Her instincts told her what she already knew. She had stayed longer than she should have. She had given them room to breathe, and now she could go. The last ridge sat still beneath her canopy, the same way it had before the first shot was ever fired. Smoke still drifted faintly along the valley's far edge. But there was no more muzzle flash, no more movement. The ambush was finished. It didn't end in a flash. It simply faded. 1 minute the air was charged with fire. The next, it was just quiet. From the ground, the comms came back in fragments, low and strained. A voice said, "Clear." A second added, "No movement west or high." Then another, a little softer, asked, "Is that her still up there?" A pause followed. Then came the answer, "She never left." Morgan didn't key the mic. She adjusted her climb angle by a few degrees and pushed her throttle forward slowly. The A-10 responded with a low groan from beneath the seat. Her airframe felt heavier than it had at launch. It always did on the return from a real mission. She kept her altitude low for the first stretch out of Narrow 7, just high enough to clear the next ridgeline without drawing attention. The valleys beyond were empty. The threat had been focused, intentional. They'd waited for that convoy, knowing the gap in coverage. Her cockpit trembled once, faintly. A system warning flashed orange, not red. Hydraulic balance showed slightly off. She acknowledged it without emotion. The panel cleared again. Her aircraft had taken no hits. Just where? She swept the valley one last time, not with instruments, but with her eyes. Her HUD gave her no new targets, no anomalies. The cliffs showed only dust and impact scars now. A blackened outcrop where her last pass had landed still glowed faintly through her IR overlay. But there was no one moving nearby. Nothing left to cover. Command came through the secure line again. The voice this time was quieter, less procedural. Last in, status update. Do you copy? She clicked on her comms, thumb resting over the side switch like it always had. Her voice came through level. Single platform complete. RTB. There was no follow-up, no comment. Just a long pause. Then a simple tone acknowledging receipt. Morgan turned toward base. She stayed light on the controls, keeping her flight path flat and wide to conserve fuel. The gauge flickered again, dancing between empty and 1/4. She didn't look at it after that. She had a feel for how far she could stretch what remained. The landscape opened beneath her as she left the pass behind. The jagged walls gave way to rolling scrubland and heat-blurred ridges. Her climb was steady, but shallow. The A-10 vibrated once more, just a pulse beneath her boots, like breath catching in a tired chest. The sun had shifted past midpoint now, lighting her canopy from the side. She adjusted trim manually and clicked off the autocomp. Halfway back, a light on her landing systems blinked yellow. Gear pressure warning, not unexpected. She reached to the override lever and set it for manual release. The mechanism confirmed the switch with a soft thud. She moved on without pause. Ahead, the base came into view, distorted at first in the heat shimmer. The runway cut a straight line through the desert like a scar, pale gray and barely visible until she dropped below 1,000 feet. Her approach was slow, not out of caution, but certainty. She didn't need to rush. Nothing about the day had been fast. It had been correct. As she descended, she saw the shape of ground crew waiting at the tarmac's edge. No movement, just still figures. One of them raised a hand over his eyes. Another lowered a headset. There were no cheers, no cameras, just quiet attention. The gear locked down with a gentle shudder. Her wheels touched the runway in a soft, even contact. The A-10 rolled forward smoothly, coasting past the marker line, then slowing as her brakes took hold. The wind through the open cockpit frame carried the familiar mix of fuel vapor and scorched air. A single crew chief stood at the end of the taxi line, arms behind his back. As she powered down the systems, he reached up and removed his cap. Not dramatically, just once. Then he held it at his side. Morgan opened the canopy. She didn't remove her helmet right away. The rush of air hit her face and dried the sweat that had been beading across her brow for the last hour. She unstrapped one buckle at a time, methodically, without hurry. The engines wound down behind her, and the air settled into its usual bass silence, filled only with distant tools clanking and birds too stubborn to leave the flight line. No one approached her jet. No one needed to. Her flight log was already written in her head. Time on station, number of passes, ammo expended, fuel status unconfirmed, estimated based on burn curve and throttle setting. But it wasn't about the log. Not really. She stepped down from the ladder with slow precision, her boots hitting the pavement without echo. The same flight gloves she had clipped to her belt before takeoff were still there, untouched. Her harness hung loose across her shoulder now, the clips brushing the leg of her suit with each step. She walked past the ground crew. They didn't speak. One of them nodded once, almost imperceptibly. She gave nothing in return, just kept moving. In the distance, the heat shimmer danced above the asphalt. The tarmac rippled, alive with the memory of everything that had happened miles away, in a place few of them would ever see firsthand. Morgan walked toward the hangar, her silhouette small against the runway's edge. Nothing followed her. No questions. No reports. Just the truth that she had stayed when others had left. And no one missed it. The debrief room was quieter than usual. No one leaned back in their chair. No one passed notes or cracked jokes while the playback rolled. The projection screen flickered with a gray, grainy loop of the mission footage overhead thermal, HUD readouts, altitude bands. The sound played low, layered with wind shear and the thump of ordnance releases. At the bottom of the display, a loiter time counted up in red. One of the analysts adjusted his glasses and paused the feed at the 15-minute mark over narrow 7. He clicked once, then let it resume. A pilot near the back asked without looking up, "Who stayed over that kill box the longest?" Another voice, slower, said, 22 minutes past safe bingo. Nobody responded at first. Then someone exhaled and added, but every shot hit. There was nothing left to say after that. The room stayed still as the last few minutes of the mission played out. Her aircraft turned through smoke, slipped over ridgelines, and banked just past the edge of visual lock. The final pass was surgical, no reticle, no onboard targeting data, just instinct angle, and the slow burn of familiarity with the terrain. Morgan stepped into the room at the edge of the last playback. She didn't interrupt. Her flight suit was streaked with dried sweat and dust, creased along the arms and legs from hours in the cockpit. Her gloves were still clipped to her belt. She had not changed. No one turned their head immediately, but they all knew she was there. The playback ended in silence. The screen held on the final telemetry screen, showing altitude, burn rate, and time on station. The number at the bottom read out clearly 22 minutes past recommended limit. Her platform identifier stood beside it, unblinking. Morgan walked past the rows of chairs without speaking. She stopped for a moment near the wallboard. At some point during the mission, someone had cleaned it. The faded red from earlier had been wiped clean. In its place, written in black permanent marker and underlined twice, were the words, "Last in." The ink was fresh. The line beneath it was straight, deliberate, and thicker than before. No one said who wrote it. No one needed to. A crew member standing near the far edge of the room caught her eye and gave a small nod. It wasn't a salute. It wasn't formal. It was the kind of nod passed between people who know exactly what was done and exactly what it cost. She didn't nod back. She just looked once more at the board, then at the printout still sitting on the edge of the conference table. It had her loiter time, her fuel projections, and her ammo expenditure marked in clean columns. She didn't touch it. Without a word, she turned and stepped back into the hallway. Her boots left faint scuffs on the polished floor, but she made no sound otherwise. The door closed gently behind her. There was no applause, no speech, but no one erased the board. And nobody not one spoke over her absence. She didn't argue. She didn't rush. And she didn't leave when others did. While the radios went quiet and the fuel ran low, she stayed alone over the valley watching, waiting, and protecting the people below with a calm the others never noticed, until it was all that remained. This was never about proving them wrong. It was about doing the job right, even when no one's watching. Her story reminds us that strength doesn't always speak first or fly fastest. Sometimes it's the last voice, the steady presence, the one who holds the line long after the spotlight has moved on. What does quiet leadership look like to you? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments and consider following for more stories like this, where respect is earned not through volume, but through presence, precision, and the choice to stay when it counts most.